It started as an ordinary afternoon on a busy city street. Pedestrians were going about their errands, cars honking in traffic, and shop doors swinging open and closed, but nothing about this day would stay ordinary for long. At the corner, 2 uniformed police officers were standing like they owned the street, barking orders at anyone who dared cross their path. Their arrogance was palpable, the kind that makes ordinary citizens shrink in fear, while the more audacious ones get a jolt of adrenaline and curiosity. And then he appeared. Jeans, worn leather jacket, calm face, eyes scanning the surroundings without a hint of hurry. No bodyguards, no entourage, just a man walking down the street as if he belonged there, and, somehow, he did. Steven Seagal. The 2 officers noticed him immediately. One of them leaned toward the other, whispering, "Think he's one of those celebrities? Probably just some old guy trying to get attention." But Steven didn't seek attention. He merely approached the street corner where the officers were blocking pedestrians. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "I need to pass through. I need to pass through." The first officer smirked. "You think you can just walk here like everyone else? Step aside, old man." His tone dripped with arrogance, a mix of authority and disrespect. Before Steven could respond, the second officer stepped forward, grabbing him roughly by the arms. "Don't talk back," he sneered. "You'll learn the hard way." Steven didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He just stood there, his calm expression unchanging, letting the officers believe they had control. Pedestrians stopped, some filming with their phones, whispering to each other. The air felt heavy, charged with tension. You could almost see the invisible line Steven drew around himself, a line of quiet confidence that refused to be broken by threats, by force, or by arrogance. Seconds stretched into eternity. The officers laughed at his stillness, tightening their grip as if that would force obedience. "You think you're tough?" one of them barked, but the moment had barely begun. The street had gone silent, everyone sensing that the next few seconds would change everything. And in that silence, in that calm that refused to yield, something was about to happen, something that would shock the arrogant cops, humiliate them, and leave every witness on that street staring in disbelief. Before we continue, pause for a second. Have you ever seen someone stay completely calm under direct threat? That moment when nothing phases them is exactly what's about to unfold here. The city street hummed with the usual chaos. Honking cars, bicycle bells, street vendors calling out their specials, and the occasional passerby lost in thought. Yet, the tension around the corner where the 2 officers stood was different, thick, almost tangible. These weren't just ordinary cops enforcing rules. They carried themselves with the kind of arrogance that comes from power unchecked. The kind of authority that believes intimidation is the only language that needs to be spoken. Officer Reynolds, tall and broad-shouldered, adjusted his sunglasses and flashed a smirk at the crowd. "Look at them," he said to his partner, Officer Matthews. "Scared of their own shadows. This is how it's supposed to be. People know who's in charge." Matthews chuckled, shoving a passerby roughly aside. "And the best part? Most of them won't even think of complaining. They know better. But every now and then, you get someone who thinks they can challenge the rules, and that's when the fun begins." And that's when Steven Seagal stepped into the frame. He moved deliberately but slowly, his presence almost unnoticeable until he was directly in front of the officers. No flashy entrances, no entourage, just him. Jeans faded at the knees, a worn leather jacket that looked decades old, and a calm expression that seemed to absorb the chaos around him rather than react to it. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet observation that made the air feel heavier, as if the world itself paused for a brief moment to assess him. "Excuse me," Steven said again, his voice calm but firm, enough to cut through the hubbub of the street. "I need to pass." Reynolds laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Pass? Who do you think you are? Streets like this aren't for wandering old men like you. Step aside before we teach you a lesson." Matthews moved closer, blocking the path entirely. "Yeah, don't act like you belong here. You'll regret it if you try." Without warning, the officers grabbed him roughly by the arms. Pedestrians gasped, some moving closer to film the incident, others frozen in shock. A small crowd started to gather, drawn by the escalating tension. Smartphones pointed at the scene, screens glowing with anticipation. Every eye was on him, but Steven did not flinch, did not resist. He simply stood there, letting them believe they had control. Reynolds tightened his grip, attempting to assert dominance. You think standing there like some monk is going to save you? You're in our world now. Stephen's lips curled into the faintest smile, almost imperceptible, but enough to make anyone watching feel the weight of his calm authority. Sometimes the world you think you control is the one that controls you, he said softly. The officers sneered but were momentarily thrown off. There was something in his calmness, the way he refused to fight back or raise his voice, that unsettled them. It was as if they were trying to force a reaction that would never come. People in the crowd whispered among themselves, astonished. Who is this man? Why isn't he struggling? Is he dangerous? One young man, holding his phone, muttered under his breath. He looks like someone famous, but why isn't anyone else noticing? Quote, Reynolds, feeling his ego prickled, barked again. Enough talking. You're under control now. Move, or we'll show you exactly what happens to people who disobey. Still, Stephen did not move. He just let their actions unfold around him, unflinching, silent, yet radiating a confidence that made it clear he was not afraid. The crowd felt it too, a ripple of tension and fascination spreading like wildfire. Children, hiding behind their parents, peeked out, and bystanders raised their eyebrows, exchanging glances that said, something is not right here. Then, a small detail caught the eye of one officer. Matthews noticed the faint glint of a ring on Stephen's finger, an emblem that looked strangely official, almost ceremonial. He shook his head, dismissing it at first. But a creeping sense of unease began to spread in his chest. There was something about this man, something that didn't belong in the ordinary world they ruled so arrogantly. Seconds stretched into minutes. Pedestrians whispered, some muttering prayers, others daring to record every detail. The officers, sensing the crowd's attention, grew increasingly tense. The arrogance that had carried them so far was beginning to falter, just slightly but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Steven Seagal's calmness became a silent challenge, a quiet test of the officers' patience and understanding. And though no one in that growing crowd could predict what would happen next, everyone could feel one thing clearly. This encounter would end differently than anyone expected. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation, as the scene held its breath. And somewhere deep within the officers, the first seeds of doubt had begun to take root, the kind of doubt that comes when you underestimate someone far more powerful than you could ever imagine. The officer's grip on Steven Seagal tightened, but his body remained perfectly still, as if anchored to the earth itself. Reynolds' face was red with frustration. Every instinct in his training screamed at him to assert control, to force obedience, but with every passing second, that instinct seemed to falter. He could feel the stares of the growing crowd, their eyes recording, analyzing, judging, and yet, Stephen didn't flinch. He didn't yell. He didn't even sigh. You think standing there like a statue is going to intimidate anyone? Reynolds barked, his voice cracking slightly with suppressed rage. I've handled men twice your size without blinking. You're nothing. Stephen's faint smile never left his face. Sometimes, he said softly, the strongest strength is knowing when not to use it. Matthews scoffed. Don't try to philosophize your way out of this. You'll learn respect the hard way, old man. He pulled harder, trying to force Stephen backward against the wall. The leather jacket creaked under the pressure, but Stephen's stance was immovable, like a rock in a river. The sudden tension in the air was almost suffocating. The crowd began murmuring, sensing that the ordinary rules of power were being challenged. Phones were raised, recording the entire scene. Flashes of light catching the metallic badges of the officers and the calm intensity in Stephen's eyes. Then, for a moment, Stephen shifted, not aggressively, not violently, but with precision. One subtle movement of his wrist, almost imperceptible, enough to loosen Matthews's grip slightly without a single sound. Reynolds noticed and stepped back, confusion etching his face. How could a man so still radiate such control? You're not scared? Matthews stammered, disbelief creeping into his voice. Stephen shook his head, still smiling faintly. Fear is temporary. Arrogance is permanent. That brief exchange was all it took for the tension in the crowd to escalate. Pedestrians whispered excitedly, "Who is this guy?" Why aren't the cops in control? I feel like he's dangerous. Some dared to step closer, recording every detail, feeling the pulse of a story unfolding that would be shared for weeks. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. He had trained for years to handle situations exactly like this. And yet, here was a man who refused to comply, refused to be intimidated, and refused to react in any way that fit the officer's expectations. It was disorienting. Arrogance alone could no longer dictate the rules of engagement. Frustration mounting, Reynolds barked again. Enough. We're taking you in whether you like it or not. He tried to move Stephen by force, but the shift in balance Stephen executed was subtle yet devastating in effect. Matthews stumbled slightly, losing his footing. And for the first time, the crowd gasped. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't violence. It was pure, unspoken mastery. Stephen's calmness alone had unbalanced them. One young woman whispered to her friend, "He didn't even touch them, and they're off balance." Did you see that? Reynolds' anger turned to panic. He tightened his grip, trying to regain control, but his arrogance had blinded him to one simple truth. He was no longer dictating the terms. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were anticipating the moment when the tables would turn. Every phone camera seemed to capture the silent duel, one side relying on brute force and authority, the other on calm precision and quiet power. And then came the whispers from the onlookers. "Wait. That face. I've seen him somewhere. Isn't that Steven Seagal?" Reynolds froze, the words striking him like lightning. Matthews' jaw tightened as realization crept in. The arrogance, the cruelty, the false confidence, it had all been aimed at a man far beyond their reckoning. Suddenly, the fear that had been missing for moments now seeped into their bones. Stephen remained calm, a beacon of silent authority. The officers, once so confident, were beginning to crumble. Their movements became hesitant. Every shove, every harsh word, was now laced with uncertainty. Pedestrians sensed it. Phones recorded it. A subtle smile spread across the lips of some onlookers. They knew the moment of reckoning was near. The crowd's whispers grew louder, the tension almost unbearable. Reynolds tried one last show of force, tightening his grip, attempting to assert control. But Matthews held him back, sensing instinctively that this man was no ordinary citizen. The arrogance that had driven them was now faltering under a force they could not see but could feel, a quiet, controlled strength that demanded respect, whether they wanted to give it or not. Stephen's eyes scanned the street, meeting the gazes of the people around him, and for the first time, the crowd felt what he carried, the weight of calm mastery, the kind that could bend a situation without a single act of aggression. The officers had crossed a line. They had tested a calm they could not comprehend, and soon, they would understand just how much they had underestimated him. The tension on the street had reached a breaking point. Pedestrians had stopped moving, their attention entirely drawn to the silent standoff. Phones were raised, recording every moment, capturing the scene that no one would soon forget. Even the traffic seemed to slow, cars inching past as if the world itself had been forced to pause and witness the confrontation. Reynolds and Matthews were now visibly shaken. Their earlier confidence, the swagger that had filled them with false superiority, had evaporated in the presence of Steven Seagal. His calm, unyielding stance had transformed the street into a courtroom where their arrogance was on trial. Sweat glistened on Reynolds' forehead as he tightened his grip, but he no longer felt in control. Matthews's knuckles turned white, the strain of their failed intimidation leaving him uneasy. The crowd began to react. Some whispered among themselves, recognizing the man immediately. "Is that Steven Seagal? No way. That's him." Others were too focused on the tension, unsure what they were witnessing, yet unable to look away. One elderly man in a nearby shop leaned over the counter and muttered to his wife, "I've seen a lot in my life, but this is something else." Stephen, meanwhile, remained perfectly composed. He did not shout. He did not struggle. His eyes scanned the officers, then the crowd, as if silently teaching a lesson through presence alone. There was no threat in his posture, no need for aggression. Yet every movement of the cops became more tentative. They were realizing, slowly and painfully, that the rules they relied on, the rules of authority, of force, of intimidation, did not apply here. A young woman, phone in hand, whispered to a friend. He's not fighting back, but he's winning. Look at them. They're panicking. The officer's attempts at dominance began to falter entirely. Reynolds tried to bark another order, but his voice wavered, betraying his uncertainty. Matthews glanced at him, panic clear in his eyes. Even the crowd began to sense it. Murmurs turned into audible gasps, as they realized the man they had underestimated was not only unshakable, but entirely in control of the moment. Then, a small, almost imperceptible gesture changed everything. Stephen shifted his stance slightly, not in aggression, not in resistance, but just enough to remind the officers that their control was an illusion. Matthews stumbled slightly, catching himself against Reynolds, and the crowd murmured in astonishment. One young man in the front whispered, "Did he just? I can't believe they're losing balance." The psychological pressure intensified. Pedestrians began to speak louder, voicing what they had been thinking all along. "He's not scared. They're scared." One child, clutching his mother's hand, peeked around and said softly, "Why is the old man so strong?" Reynolds' anger shifted to disbelief. He had handled the toughest crowds, the most dangerous situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. Every instinct to assert dominance now collided with a new reality. This man's calmness was more powerful than any force they could muster. The arrogance that had carried them for years was crumbling. At that moment, someone in the crowd gasped loudly. An elderly clerk, leaning on a nearby wall, narrowed his eyes. "Wait, that face. I've seen him somewhere." He murmured to the person next to him. "That's him, Steven Seagal." The revelation hit the officers like a thunderclap. Their eyes widened. Matthews faltered entirely, his grip loosening instinctively. Reynolds' jaw tightened, disbelief turning into panic. The arrogance, the confidence, the superiority they had been meaningless in the presence of someone whose quiet authority far outweighed their badges. Even the crowd began to sense the reversal. People whispered, some recording, some pointing. The air was thick with anticipation. Something was about to happen, something that would utterly humiliate the arrogant officers and leave the bystanders in awe. Stephen did not move. He did not shout. He simply stood there, radiating calm dominance. Every eye in the crowd was drawn to him, every whisper hanging in the air, and in that silence, the realization was clear. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The arrogant cops had crossed a line they could not understand, and the street itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the quietest man there would reveal just how powerful he truly was. And then, from a distance, the faint sound of a black car engine echoed down the street. Heads turned. The crowd stirred with curiosity, sensing that the arrival of someone else might finally tip the scales. The cops, already unsteady, now looked toward the approaching sound with mounting dread. The moment they had thought would be routine, a simple display of authority, was about to collapse entirely. The tension was palpable. Every pedestrian, every phone camera, every person on the street felt it. And as the black car approached, one question burned in the minds of everyone watching. What would happen next? The low rumble of a black SUV grew louder as it approached the corner, the street seeming to shrink around its presence. Pedestrians instinctively stepped back, eyes widening, phones raised to capture the moment. The officer's grip on Stephen faltered as the unmistakable sound of polished tires rolling on asphalt cut through the tense silence. Reynolds and Matthews glanced at each other, a flicker of uncertainty passing between them. Something about the approaching vehicle unsettled them. They had thought they were in control, that their authority was absolute, but the instinctive unease they now felt told them they had miscalculated. The SUV came to a smooth stop just a few feet from the confrontation. Doors swung open, and three sharply dressed executives stepped out, carrying folders, clipboards, and an air of urgency. Their expressions were serious, commanding. One of them broke into a run, moving quickly towards Stephen. "Mr. Seagal, we've been waiting for you, sir," the lead executive called out, his voice firm yet respectful. Reynolds froze, his eyes darting from the approaching men to Stephen, confusion and shock washing over his face. Matthews stepped back instinctively, sensing the growing realization that the man they had just tried to intimidate was no ordinary citizen. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Phones raised, people whispered excitedly, "Is that him? He's the owner?" Or part of some agency? I knew it. That's Steven Seagal. Steven's faint smile deepened ever so slightly. He nodded at the executives but did not move from his position. There was no dramatic gesture, no shouting. Yet in that moment, his authority was absolute. The street had shifted. Arrogance no longer had a place here. Reynolds swallowed hard. Wait. Mr. Seagal? You mean, that's him? He stammered, his earlier confidence crumbling into disbelief. Matthews looked equally dumbfounded, unable to form words. The reality of their mistake hit them like a sledgehammer. They had publicly humiliated a man far more powerful than they could comprehend. Yes. One of the executives confirmed, handing Steven a folder with documents. We were supposed to meet you a few blocks away, but it seems you've arrived early. This is all under your jurisdiction now. The crowd gasped again. Pedestrians whispered to each other, excitement and awe mixing in their voices. Some pointed, others laughed nervously. Children peered from behind their parents, sensing the tension but also the reversal of power happening right before their eyes. Steven finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, carrying authority that made even the most skeptical bystander take notice. I came here to check on operations, and to make sure respect is maintained where it matters. He gestured toward the officers, who now seemed smaller than the onlookers, humbled by the moment. The executives stepped forward, organizing themselves quickly. One handed Steven a tablet showing the bank's or city block's security protocols, while another displayed a list of ongoing issues in the area. The documents were meticulous, precise, and demonstrated that Steven's presence was not only expected but necessary. The officers, meanwhile, stood frozen, their earlier aggression replaced by shock and guilt. Reynolds opened his mouth but found no words. Matthews swallowed nervously, his eyes darting between the crowd, the executives, and Steven. For the first time in their careers, the arrogance that had defined them offered no protection. They had misjudged the situation entirely, and the consequences of that misjudgment were staring them in the face. Steven turned to the officers, his eyes calm but piercing. You believed that your badges and authority made you powerful, but power without respect is meaningless. Today, you were tested, and you failed not because of strength, but because of arrogance. The crowd murmured in agreement, recording every word. Some people nodded knowingly, others gasped, and a few clapped softly. The atmosphere was electric. It was a lesson not just for the officers but for everyone watching. True authority is measured by respect, not fear. Reynolds finally dropped his gaze, trembling slightly. Sir, we didn't know who you were, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Matthews nodded beside him, silent but equally remorseful. Steven's expression softened only slightly. That's exactly the problem, he said. You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat people with respect. That is a lesson you should carry forward. The executive stepped closer, showing documents that clarified Steven's authority over the area, reinforcing the fact that the officers had completely misjudged the situation. The entire street seemed to exhale collectively, the tension dissipating as the truth became clear. Steven Seagal had remained calm, controlled, and entirely in command, even while being physically restrained moments before. As the crowd watched in awe, the officers stepped back, humbled and silent. The reversal of power was complete. They had been confronted with a presence they could not intimidate, a lesson in humility that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The street was no longer a place of authority dictated by ego. It had become a classroom in respect, silent mastery, and the quiet power of someone who never needed to raise a hand to teach a lesson. And in that moment, every witness knew one thing for certain. Arrogance had no place when confronted by calm strength, and Steven Seagal had just proven it. In a way no one would ever forget. The street was still buzzing with tension, but the overwhelming shock had begun to give way to clarity. Pedestrians who had been frozen in awe, fear, and disbelief now whispered among themselves, trying to process what had just happened. The arrogant officers, Reynolds and Matthews, stood awkwardly near the edge of the crowd, their earlier swagger replaced by silence, confusion, and a deep sense of guilt. Every instinct they had relied on had failed them, and now, they had no idea how to reclaim even a shred of dignity. Steven Seagal remained calm, his presence commanding yet understated. He had been quiet for nearly the entire confrontation, observing the chaos his calm had created, letting the crowd, the officers, and even the environment itself respond to his measured energy. And now, at last, he stepped forward, finally breaking the silence. "Power is not in your badge," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "Authority without respect is meaningless. True strength is measured by how you treat others when no one is watching." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Reynolds swallowed hard, avoiding eye contact. Matthew's fists clenched at his sides, trembling slightly as the weight of their humiliation settled in. For the first time, they understood that they had crossed a line, that arrogance had blinded them to the simplest of truths. Respect is earned, not demanded. One of the onlookers, the elderly clerk who had observed everything quietly from the corner, stepped forward. He had not joined the crowd's excitement, nor had he tried to intervene during the confrontation. Unlike the others, he had treated Stephen with quiet respect from the beginning. His calm observation had not gone unnoticed. Stephen turned his attention toward him, his eyes meeting the clerk's with a subtle nod of approval. "You," Stephen said quietly but firmly, "have understood what many could not. From today, you will be in charge here. Lead with respect, and ensure that the arrogance we just witnessed is never repeated." The clerk's eyes widened in shock. "Me, sir? I don't know what to say. Actions speak louder than words." Stephen replied simply, "You have already demonstrated the character required." The crowd murmured their approval. Some clapped softly, others recorded the moment, knowing that they were witnessing a rare act of recognition and justice. Meanwhile, Reynolds and Matthews could only watch, powerless and humbled. The lesson they had been forced to learn was not only personal but public, witnessed by dozens of bystanders who would share this story far and wide. Stephen turned back to the officers, his expression firm but not cruel. "You have been given a second chance," he said. "Learn from it. Arrogance is a weakness. Respect is strength. Let today be a lesson you never forget." Reynolds finally dropped to his knees, trembling. "Sir, I am so sorry. I had no idea who you were. I was wrong." Matthews nodded silently beside him, guilt etched deeply on his face. There were no excuses left. No words could undo the mistake, but acknowledgement was the first step. Stephen's calmness, combined with his quiet authority, had brought even the most arrogant officers to humility without a single act of violence. The executives accompanying Stephen began to organize the remaining crowd, ensuring that the street would soon return to order. Pedestrians whispered excitedly among themselves, recounting every detail, replaying the moment in their minds. Phones still recorded, capturing the expressions, the gestures, and the quiet but unmistakable power of a man who needed no physical confrontation to command respect. Stephen turned one last time toward the crowd. "Remember this moment," he said. "It is not about fear, intimidation, or force. It is about integrity, patience, and respect. Those who understand that will always stand taller than those who rely on arrogance." With that, he walked calmly toward the black SUV. The executives flanked him, closing the doors, and the vehicle glided away smoothly, leaving the street behind, a street that would never forget the events that had unfolded. Reynolds and Matthews remained on the curb, still processing what had just occurred. The lesson was clear, indelible. They had faced someone who embodied strength without aggression, control without force, and respect without fear. The crowd dispersed slowly, many exchanging glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others quietly inspired, and the elderly clerk, now the new authority on that street corner, looked after Stephen's departing figure. He understood that the lesson he had been entrusted to uphold went far beyond one street, one confrontation, or even two arrogant officers. It was a universal truth about respect, power, and the quiet authority of those who act with integrity. As the last echoes of the black SUV faded into the distance, a sense of calm settled over the street. What had started as a moment of confrontation had transformed into a lesson for everyone present, a lesson about humility, the consequences of arrogance, and the enduring power of quiet strength. The street, once tense and chaotic, had now quieted into an almost reverent stillness. Pedestrians who had been recording, whispering, and gasping moments ago now stood in thoughtful silence, processing what had just unfolded. What had started as a confrontation between two arrogant officers and a lone man had transformed into a lesson in respect, patience, and true power. Steven Seagal's departure in the black SUV left a lingering presence, a calm authority that seemed to hang in the air. The crowd exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet understanding, others shaking their heads in disbelief. It was clear to everyone who had witnessed the events. This was not just a story about cops and a famous actor. It was a story about humility, about how arrogance blinds even those who hold power, and how true strength is revealed not in force, but in composure, observation, and self-control. The two officers, Reynolds and Matthews, remained on the curb, humbled and shaken. Their badges and uniforms could no longer shield them from the truth. They had misjudged someone far stronger than themselves. Their arrogance had been dismantled by a quiet, measured presence, and the lesson was indelible. Meanwhile, the elderly clerk, who had observed everything with calm and respect, now stood in a new role of responsibility. He had been promoted, not through force, not through connections, but because he had understood the principles that mattered most: patience, humility, and integrity. Steven had recognized these qualities and entrusted him with leadership. It was a reminder to everyone watching that sometimes quiet observance and respect speak louder than words or actions. The moral of the story rippled through the crowd like an invisible current. True respect is not reserved for the famous, the powerful, or those who can command attention. It is given freely to everyone, especially when no one is watching, because one day, the person you overlook or insult may be the one with the power to shape your world. Pedestrians began to discuss the moment among themselves, recounting details with amazement. "Did you see how calm he stayed?" one whispered. "It's like he controlled the entire street without moving a finger." Another added, "The cops didn't know what hit them." That was a lesson in humility for anyone watching. Social media would soon explode with clips from the street, replaying Steven's calm authority and the officer's gradual unraveling. The lesson was universal. Arrogance, unchecked, is a liability. Patience, composure, and respect are far more powerful than brute force or aggression. Steven's quiet exit left an impression that went far beyond the street corner. It reminded everyone that true authority is not loud, aggressive, or performative. It is silent, measured, and earned through consistency, integrity, and the ability to maintain calm under pressure. The crowd's murmurs reflected this understanding. Some clapped softly, others simply nodded, recognizing that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Finally, a voice from the crowd called out, "Type respect if you believe humility is real strength." Phones flashed as people typed, commented, and shared their thoughts, engaging in the lesson that had unfolded before them. Another added, "Tell me where you're watching from. I want to thank every kind soul personally." The engagement, the reflection, the collective recognition of the moral, it was exactly the effect Steven's quiet presence had intended. In that moment, the street had transformed from a scene of confrontation, arrogance, and intimidation. It had become a stage for understanding, reflection, and inspiration. The lesson was clear. Humility is strength. Calm is power. Respect is earned, not demanded. Arrogance, no matter how boldly displayed, is fragile in the face of quiet mastery. As the crowd dispersed, many carried the lesson with them, sharing it with friends, family, and co-workers. The story would live on, a reminder that power is not in authority alone, but in the integrity and composure of those who wield it wisely. And somewhere, in the quiet distance, Steven Seagal's calm presence lingered not as a threat, not as a celebrity, but as a living example of what true strength looks like. Silent, measured, and utterly undeniable.